pleasure to have you here at the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum. I'm Bob Jolly, Athenaeum Director, and we are pleased and proud to have Laura Stevenson here talking about her new book of stories, Liar from Vermont. If you haven't read it, it's a great book. This is a sort of special event for the Athenaeum's Art and Culture series, so I want to thank the sponsor for this series, which is Philip and Mary Lou Meyer. They are people who do not live here. Their parents lived here. They are great supporters of this series and as a result of the Athenaeum, and that's really what makes these programs happen, support from people who like what we do. The next and last Arts and Culture lecture for this season will be next Wednesday, August 12th. Our own librarian, Bryn Hoffman, will be, excuse me, talking about membership libraries. So if you've been waiting to find out all of the information about membership libraries, next Wednesday, 7 o'clock right here. I think that's all of the news I had to get to. Beth Cannell is here to introduce Laura, and I want to introduce Beth. Beth is the author of 3 adventure travel guides, a book of Vermont poetry, and 2 local histories. Most recently, her storytelling has focused on teen audiences. Her books in this area include the titles Darkness Under the Water, The Secret Room, All That Glitters, and Cold Midnight. She is also a professional copy editor and co-owner with her husband Dave, who is here, of Kingdom Books, a poetry and mystery specialty business. Please welcome Beth Cannell.
Thank you, Bob, and it's good to see everybody here. I said to Laura, you can count on the fact that the people who are here are the ones who really want to be here, and that's us tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce author Laura C. Stevenson this evening. In a way, I am also welcoming Laura home to the Vermont that her protagonist, Peggy, in the new collection Liar from Vermont, is terrified of losing. Because this is the gift of the Northeast Kingdom. Here we stubbornly try to hold on to rural treasures like open land, hardscrabble farms, and community members who care about each other. Coming from Wilmington, Vermont, between Brattleboro and Bennington, Laura Stevenson has seen firsthand the dramatic losses that economic development can bring to a rural area. Like Peggy in her story, Laura grew up in urban Ann Arbor, Michigan, a haven for professors, writers, artists, and sophisticated educational life. Again, like Peggy, she summered in Vermont, but she turned early to writing, beginning with poetry at age 8, then prose, and started her first novel at age 11. Steadily published from college onward, she chose to supplement her path with teaching history. Her university journeys took her to Yale and the University of California at Santa Barbara, then back east for a Mellon Faculty Fellowship at Harvard with her 2 daughters. During this process, she brought out impressive academic work, but also faced the enormous challenge of losing her hearing, and for some years grappled with the isolation that disability can bring. She rose to her challenges, and in 1986 returned to teaching, this time at Marlborough College. With her marriage to the poet F.D. Reeve and their joint world of rural life and New York City poetics, her life and her writing continued to blossom. These victories are probed and shown in their layered complexity within Laura's own novels, whether for children, as with Happily After All the King's Horses, and A Castle in the Window, for young adults, as in The Island and the Ring, or in her highly entertaining novel, Return in Kind, and the linked stories we celebrate this evening, Liar from Vermont. Laura still lives in Vermont, in the farmhouse that her family has owned since 1951. This evening, we enter her world, that world that we in the Northeast Kingdom recognize with such warmth. And we learn from this professor the process of taking a good life and adding the powerful threads of fiction to create a memorable tapestry of love and loss. Please join me in welcoming Laura C. Stevenson to St. Johnsbury.
Thank you, Beth. And many thanks to Neil and to Janice for having supported these stories for their long journey from their inception to now into print. And may I add, it's a real honor to be speaking here in this wonderful library with all its historical echoes. Marvelous. So I've promised to talk about writing from life, and I must hurry to clarify my mood. I am not saying here is the scoop on writing, turning experience into fiction. Come and get it. I'm meditating on the old saw, write what you know. A terrible old saw it is. And considering what it actually means about the interrelationship of experience and fiction. Please don't assume it means you have to have an interesting life in order to write fiction. It can help, all right? I still remember the envious faces in one of my fiction seminars when a student said his father was a big-time bank robber. I assured them, as I assure you, even mundane life experience can inform the writing of fiction. Let's start by putting the old saw into the negative. Don't write what you don't know. When I was 11, my sister gave me a typewriter. And clearly one of the things you did with a typewriter was write a mystery novel. So I typed away, and the story became a cross between Agatha Christie and the Black Stallion. Aside from the male narrator, my characters were all old people in their 30s. One of them was pregnant. I loved them all so much, I couldn't decide which one of them had done the evil deed, and so the novel remained unfinished. As I moved into high school, tolerant teachers looked at the melodrama that followed the mystery and told me, write what you know. But I didn't have any experience worth knowing. A happy childhood is such a drag. Still, I switched bravely to realism, and by the time I got to college, I could turn out a Dorothy Parker story or a semi-realistic humorous fantasy with some success. But nothing that I wrote had the depth of the fiction that had inspired me to write fiction in the first place. I didn't realize that was because the only experience I was drawing on was my literary experience. I certainly had no idea that my difficulties were classic. I just thought I had no talent. My solution was to become an historian, and I spent the next 17 years telling the truth, while I developed my understanding of Tudor England. I wrote a well-received book on Elizabethan culture and society, but at an interview, one historian told me, you know, I've rarely read a monograph that was so personal. I think it was a compliment, but it made me wonder, and not for the first time, if I'd chosen the right profession. During the years in which I'd been writing history, I'd produced 2 little girls to whom I told stories a dozen times a day. They liked the stories. I liked the stories. Adults suggested I should write the stories down. I tried. They went flat. It was most discouraging. So were a lot of other things. Divorce, single motherhood, and the onset of profound deafness that lost me my academic job. At the same time, it robbed me of my backup profession as a violinist. Faced with poverty and a life that was fast turning to a grade D movie, I moved to my family's abandoned summer house in Vermont and became a cleaning lady. And then, since the sociological interest of housekeeping tends to wear off quickly, I decided to try fiction again. I went to a summer writing workshop at Bennington College, taking with me the same sort of story I'd been writing when I was 19, fun intellectually, but inauthentic emotionally. The instructor wearily suggested, guess what? Write what you know. So out of desperation, I wrote a story based on a minor episode in my childhood. And it worked. It was the major breakthrough of my writing career. The story was called Liar from Vermont. And it was about a 7-year-old girl named Peggy Hamilton, the third daughter, much youngest, in a Michigan academic family that summered in Vermont. In its current form, it's the first and title story of the book Neil and Janice have just published. In its original form, typed, of course, in those pre-computer days, it sat in a drawer for nearly 30 years. There are various reasons why it sat in a drawer. One of them was that I couldn't quite figure out how to pull it together at the end. Another was that I couldn't quite figure out whether I should make it a one-off or whether it should be the beginning of a sequence. But the third and major reason was that it taught me that writing about experience has its perils as well as its pleasures. Shortly after I finished the story, I had a visit from my eldest sister, who was and is well known in British poetry circles. I timidly showed the story to her, and she went ballistic. Distortion, injustice, parody. If I ever published it, she'd tell everybody what a disgrace it was and make sure it got terrible reviews. In retrospect, I suppose I could have pointed out that the distortion was deliberate, that autobiographical fiction isn't autobiography, but I really hadn't figured out all that stuff yet. And I was acutely aware of not knowing what I was doing, and, well, we all have families. And there's a great deal to be said for peace. So I put Peggy in a drawer and stopped writing autobiographical fiction. That doesn't mean, however, that I stopped writing from life. What Peggy taught me was that I could use aspects of my life as a ground base for my fiction, composing melodies of imagination that harmonized with it. So that's what I did. To give an example, Happily After All, my first novel, is about a child of a bitter divorce whose father's death has made it necessary for her to leave California and live with her hated and unknown mother in Vermont. I wrote it for one of my daughters who had recently decided she wanted to live with her father and stepmother rather than with me. But she didn't want to miss out on the stories I'd always told them. The plot, and let's be fair, the bitter custody case, is entirely fictitious. But the ground base, the pain of losing a daughter, is authentic. And it gives the book its power. Now, I should add that power did not spring fully formed from my forehead. Initially, the book went astray for reasons transparent but less clear then. I rushed the reconciliation between mother and daughter by making the mother survive divorce and stop that there, okay. By making the mother survive divorce and pain and loss of a daughter without any bad things happening to her. I showed it to a friend who said, You've got to rewrite this. It's sappy, it's sentimental, and it doesn't have any plot. Okay. Once I'd investigated the mother's emotions more deeply, sentimentality was no longer a temptation. And as my fictional mother and daughter worked through their mutual resentments, the plot fixed itself. What I learned to do in Happily After All and continued to do in its successors was not in the least original. It's how writers write what they know. Consciously or subconsciously, they recreate their own emotional experience in the lives of their characters. This process, it sometimes involves re-experiencing repressed or forgotten emotions right there at the computer. I never quite get used to it. Wow, where did that come from? But it's necessary. Only when writers have successfully captured experience, pain, joy, fear, hatred, love, whatever, on the page, can their readers share those emotions and identify with the imaginary people in the book. I can't speak for other writers, but to me, establishing that emotional ground base is the most difficult part of authenticity in writing. The melodies, plot, theme, setting, character development can be imagined, even faked. Emotional authenticity can't. The problem is, emotional authenticity is hard to come by. It usually gets distorted by the inauthentic stereotype structures that shape experience in writing as in life. They're familiar to all of us, and ironically, though they're usually attributed to the nefarious effects of TV and advertising, most of them are literary. There's confessional, I was a sinner, but now I'm saved. There's its first cousin, kiss and tell, which is gossip made lucrative if you've kissed the right people. There's the poor boy made good, and his mirror image, the honest man who refuses to sell out. There's romance, Harlequin and otherwise, and its first cousins, adultery, disillusion, divorce, not necessarily in that order. Attending these structures are flocks of ready-made moods, self-condemnation, self-congratulation, self-righteousness, hatred, resentment, nostalgia, sentimentality. If you're a writer, all these prefabricated experiences crowd around your computer from the moment your fingers hit the keys, disguising themselves as muses and begging you to immortalize them on the screen. The writing that happens as a result of listening to these muses is not necessarily insincere. I know, because I've thrown my whole heart into writing fiction that sincerely reflected the structures I'd willingly adopted in order to avoid reality. And I've spent most of my professional life reading the manuscripts of deeply committed young writers similarly protected from profound emotion by the voices that whisper stereotyped stories in their ears. The well-kept secret of writing is that there's a difference between insincerity, the saying or writing of something you don't believe in order to gain approval, and inauthenticity, which is just the inability to set aside the stereotypes that govern our lives and dreams in order to see clearly and experience deeply. Generally, that inability is learned, even cultivated. It's a matter of defense. It begins in school, where acceptance is so important. It continues later in life, mostly out of necessity, given families with 2 jobs and 2 kids. Forget authenticity. You're lucky if you can keep calm and carry on. Perhaps most seriously, from first grade to last job, there is a substantial penalty on experiencing emotionally what you see clearly. The world, seen with real clarity, is not the safe habitat the prefab muses assure us we live in. And if you insist on seeing clearly, 2 of the emotions you feel most deeply are isolation and self-doubt. It is, after all, impossible not to wonder about yourself when you know you don't see the things the way other people do, and that they confuse your emotional authenticity with yet another prefab term, neurosis. This brings us back to Peggy Hamilton, the liar from Vermont, whose story I took out of a drawer a few years ago and started to make into the collection I'm introducing here. There are now 10 stories. The first set in 1953, when Peggy is 7. The last is set in 1964, when she leaves Vermont, knowing that her childhood summers are over. It contains incidents that my family can recognize. Its ground base contains a fair amount of re-experienced emotion. In fact, there are certain passages here whose memories took me weeks to work through, enough to write about. But please, consider the title. We're talking about liars here. And guess who's the biggest one? At a rough estimate, 30% of the book's content is factually accurate. The other 70% never happened to me or to anybody else. While a few characters have a murky resemblance to old-timers in Wilmington, Vermont, their reality has been, shall we say, sacrificed to the demands of plot and theme. It's a book about lying. It's a book about stories. It's a book about the way imagination shapes and is shaped by reality. It's also very much a book about Vermont, specifically about a summer house, its history, and the way its metamorphosis reflects the changes in mid-20th century Vermont. That summer house provides 90% of the 30% of the book that's true. And since a picture is worth 1,000 lies, let me offer you a visual history. Can you see it? Is it in focus enough to see? Okay. Here is the house and its view in the beginning of the 20th century. It was then about 60 years old, and it belonged to Jared and Mary Sage. At that time, the farm consisted of the house with a long L of sheds, 3 big barns, and various outbuildings. It's a tribute of the good hands of the Sages, who owned it only for 15 years of its long history, that until street numbers went in a few years ago, it was still known as the Sage Place. After Jared Sage's death, the prosperous neighboring farmer added it to his large holding and made it into a tenant house. The Wilmington economy shortly thereafter tanked. and which was very hard on Wilmington and hard on the tenants. Here's what the house looked like in the 1920s. It suffered even more during the Depression. Its barns fell down, its sheds fell down, and in 1930s, it looked like this. In 1942, a New York couple bought the large farm of which the Sage place had become a part. They fixed up the Sage place a little, but before they could do anything with it, he died, and she sold it, and she took a mortgage, which she then foreclosed. Into this mess stepped my parents in 1951. It took 4 years to straighten it out. The house looked like that. My parents put in plumbing. They painted it, and they replaced it. Its ruined L, which used to go out there, with a woodshed. Here it is, completed at the end of that year. It still looks very much like that. I haven't messed around with it. I do paint it now and then. 10 years later, they made further improvements. A barn, and a tennis court. This is the historical progression that underlies Peggy's story. Her family belongs to an academic generation newly enlarged by the GI Bill. Just at the same time, farming in Vermont was hitting a low spot and land was amazingly cheap. $9,000 for 115 acres and a house. Taxes, $75 a year. This means the Hamiltons are summer people with complicated and tangential relationship to the community in which they spend 3 months a year. The stories investigate Peggy's discovery of that relationship as she tries to figure out where she belongs. I'm going to go back. No, I think I'll. There, okay. Now, at 7, Peggy has no doubts at all about where she belongs. In Vermont, where there are cows, there's haying, and there are horses, wonderful horses. There are also people entirely different from the ones that have surrounded her in the Michigan University town. That's her real home. Her love of Vermont provokes the lie in the book's title. Here's the deal. Peggy's father, who was called the Great Man throughout the book, is a distinguished classicist who has been invited to spend a year at Harvard. Peggy finds herself in a Belmont public school, very different from John Dewey Elementary School, where she has gone at home. As she puts it, I'd never seen perfectly quiet children before. At John Dewey, we were encouraged to express ourselves. Her teacher, Miss Coffin, has asked the class to write her name on the paper provided. Peggy does that, and then she dreams off about the wonderful workhorses that their Vermont neighbor, Mr. Bartlett, has used to build them a wall. And suddenly, she is shot back into the real world. Peggy Does this look like what you saw on the board? Miss Coffin was standing at my right elbow, frowning. I looked at her carefully, which was how, at John Dewey, you figured out if your teacher was smarter than you were. Most of them weren't. They tended to have eyes like cows, soft and kind, but with only one expression. The great man said this was because they had a theory. But there was nothing theoretical about Miss Coffin's gray-blue eyes. I decided not to sass. Well, no, not exactly. The letters didn't go the same direction. They'd remarked on this at John Dewey, but they'd said it was a sign of originality. Let me see you write it. I picked up the pencil in my left hand and started in as neatly as I could, but she stopped me. That's backwards. Can you make it go the other way? I could, if I really thought about it. But it was hard to concentrate with her watching me like that. So some of the letters went backwards, even though the printing went the right way this time. All the other children, still silent, were watching me. I put my hand behind my back, and Miss Coffin, still frowning, finished checking the other papers in my row. I looked out the window. In Vermont, my hideout was across the Mullen, a granite ledge, gray, streaked with white marble. At its top, moss grew thick, green, and moldy smelling, so deep that when I lay on my back, it tickled my nose. Underneath the ledge, on its sunny side, three-leaved plants bore strawberries between devil's paintbrushes and buttercups. Some days, I lay there all morning, rolling my tongue over the tiny red sweetnesses that tasted like dirt and grass, sniffing the lemon smell of crushed fern, listening to the white-throated sparrows sing their 4 sad notes in the humid sunlight. Boys and girls, Miss Coffin was saying, Peggy Hamilton is our new girl this year. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Peggy? What was there to tell? They already knew I couldn't write. Miss Coffin smiled. Just tell us what you'd like us to know about you. What I'd like them to know? Well, that was easy. I'm from Vermont, I said proudly. My dad has 100 acres there, and we farm it. We have 10 heifers and 15 milk cows and a bull, and an old tractor and 2 workhorses, Tommy and Teddy. My dad builds walls, and my mom, well, she helps out with the chores and stuff. I stopped. My fingers crossed inside my clenched fists. Miss Coffin looked puzzled. Thank you, Peggy. Having lied in public, Peggy has to keep up the story. That's tough because she lives right across the street from school. But Peggy is intrepid, so nobody questions her, and even the principal gets interested. After 6 weeks of this, however, Miss Coffin sends a note to Peggy's mother, and the whole story is revealed at the dinner party given to celebrate the publication of the great man's translation of the Odyssey. The guests marvel. Why would a Harvard professor's daughter ever claim that her father is just a small farmer? A psychologist present, on hearing that Peggy drifts off into dreams of Vermont, suggests she might be schizophrenic. At her end of the table, she's saved by a private conversation with her friend, Mr. Zander, who tells her she's as good a liar as Odysseus. She's a little puzzled by this, and so she demurs, and he argues back. When you talk about the way you live on your farm in Vermont, what do people do? Call you a liar? Walk away? No. They listen. And why would they do that? Because I thought of the principal's face, and even sometimes Miss Coffin's. Because they're interested. You bet they are. This is undoubtedly the first time any of them have met a second grader who can make life on a Vermont farm as real to them as Odysseus made the Cyclops. There was something he was missing. I couldn't quite figure out what it was, but it seemed so important that I objected instead of just shutting up. The life they're listening to isn't mine, I said. It's sort of Joan's, but not really. It's the life I go to, like tonight when you called you back. He smiled. Sure. That's why you can tell such a convincing story. But isn't going to a place like that, isn't that wrong? I mean, I know it's not real, but sometimes it's so much realer than, I looked around the table, well, this. Or school. Isn't that whatever Mr. Steiner was saying? No, he said. It's doing what you have to do. When you don't quite fit into the puzzle you've got to live in. Mr. Zander, our hero, is a leftist in the McCarthy era. He is the owner of a classic MG and a well-known novelist who understands the connection between lying and fiction. He is Peggy's staunchest supporter from the time she's 7 and he's 27 till the time she's 18 and he's 38, and the relationship has gotten a little more complicated. His remark about Peggy's not fitting into the puzzle she has to live in sets up the basic theme of the stories, which are all about her quest for belonging in a family, a place, a time, and a social class. Part of Peggy's difficulty is her refusal to be the kind of girl the 1950s thinks she should be. If it's a problem at 7, imagine what it's like as junior high threatens. The summer I turned 12, I learned that not fitting in was my permanent condition. Until then, I'd had hopes. Grown-ups had assured me the problem was the other kids, and so it would fade away when they caught up with me. Eventually, said Mother, Elizabeth and Darcy and Jane Eyre and Jo March would become their best friends. Eventually, said the great man, they'd meet Odysseus and Narcissus and Apollo, and we'd all be the same. Meanwhile, it was okay. It was even a kind of Presbyterian virtue that I didn't know the rules in football, didn't understand why Elvis Presley was such a big deal, and couldn't openly share the Zorro craze because I knew from Mr. Zander that Walt Disney was a proto-fascist. So, for most of my years at John Dewey Elementary School, I endured semi-isolation as something temporary. Then, in the spring of 6th grade, my class got a tour of the junior high we were going to go to next year. And within a week, lots of the girls who'd been perfectly happy to play horses or tag suddenly started talking about boys and dances and lipstick. And even my friend Shirley, who was much too bright to swoon over posters of Guy Williams, proudly showed me that she'd started wearing a bra, as if that were an honor instead of something you didn't mention. And suddenly, I found myself enduring semi-isolation that threatened to be permanent. I was the third girl in the family, which sometimes called up one of the favorite stories during dinner parties. It seems that when the great man told his mother that a baby was to be born into a family of teenage girls, she said, "Well, if it's a boy, we'll all drink champagne. If it's a girl, we'll eat a sour pickle." Of course, I'd been welcome anyway, my mother would say hastily, as the guests laughed, and the great man would add that Vermont had turned me into as good a son as any man could wish for. Well, clearly, the status of only son was not one I could forgo, especially since I agreed with the great man and Mr. Zander, who sneered at the makeup, self-conscious giggling, and fake dumbness girls thought made them attractive to men. No, I was going to stay a boy-girl, admiring Mr. Rochester, Darcy Mowgli, Odysseus, Achilles, and Mr. Zander. At the top of my admiration list, though, was Mr. Bartlett, who never raised his voice, but was a war hero, and he was so strong he could throw a hay bale to the top of a loaded truck or pick up a sledgehammer by the end of its shaft and raise it straight out to the side. He would have been my role model, but that couldn't be. The teacher who had introduced us to the concept and asked us to identify our role models had divided the blackboard into two columns, one for boys and one for girls. Peggy ignores the blackboard and worships Mr. Bartlett. That summer, she hurries to the Bartlett's farm first thing, eager to tell them that she's finally tall enough to drive a tractor solo. But when she gets there, nobody's home. Impossible. It's milking time. As she stands in the dooryard, mystified, Mr. Wolfson, the hired man from the larger farm on the other side of their house, drives up and announces he has come to do the milking because Jim Bartlett has had a heart attack. The problem, he says bitterly, is worry. The Bartlett farm is going under. Peggy takes this terrible news home, where Mr. Zander has come for dinner. And Mr. Zander, after he's remarked that Jim Bartlett was only 37, says he's the first of the last to go. He's what? I said. I mean, he's the first to die of the tiny generation of farmers who came back to Vermont after the war. He was right to come back, I said tearfully. He sure was, said Mr. Zander. But there were plenty of other farmers in office jobs like mine, which means the Army introduced them to indoor bathrooms, running water, heat that came on when you turned the dial, steady work, and they left for the city or the suburbs. He gave me a sad smile. That's why your fields are grown over, and you have barn cellars to play in instead of barns. The great man said something about land prices, and they were off, but I was only half listening. Because what Mr. Zander had said about barn cellars and fields had popped a balloon in my mind, and I was staring at what was left. Like my status of boy-girl, the popped balloon had "not fitting in" scribbled all across its shriveled remains. I'd made the balloon when I'd been little, imagining a life of me that was really a Bartlett, And I had created a life for that imaginary me out of things I'd never actually done, though they were based on things I had, like bringing in the cows and haying and halter-breaking calves. What I realized, sitting in the kitchen and looking out the window at the brush and second-growth trees, was that I hadn't actually lived that life, and that outside of my imagination, Vermont wasn't a golden world where it was always summer, but a place that drove farmers away to the kind of life I found so dull, and where war heroes who stayed loyal to their fields, barns, and cows died of worry. Peggy's parents and Mr. Zander assure her that they will go over to the Bartletts first thing in the morning and help out. But as we sat down to eat, I reflected that first thing in the morning meant 10 o'clock for us, by which time the Bartletts would have been up for 5 or 6 hours, and that none of them had realized the most important thing they could do was the milking. Milking, with its quiet barn, meditatively munching cows, chugging machines, and expectant cats, had no place in their Vermont. As I listened to them turn the conversation to the great man's latest translation and Mr. Zander's new novel, I realized with dreadful clarity that the world I was supposed to fit into was not the Bartletts, but theirs. She's right, of course. But she resists. She holds on to her boy-girl perspective, and she learns to call it androgyny as soon as she's figured out how to spell it and looked it up. This sounds all very now, but she lives in a much simpler world than we do. And she's merely reacting to her mother's ideal of ladylike behavior. High on the ladylike list comes the necessity of learning to lose graciously to men in competitive situations, like the school chess tournament in which she has had the temerity to beat one of the top-seeded boys. "I wiped up the board with him," she says happily, and her mother replies, "If you want to keep playing with boys, you'll have to learn subtle strategies of competition. The point is to play as well as you can, but ignore mistakes that would let you win, so that they appreciate your skill as an opponent without seeing you as a threat." Disclosure, that's part of the 30%. Faced with the dismal prospect of ladylike self-deprecation and upper middle-class future, Peggy treasures Vermont as a place where androgyny is possible. But Vermont is changing as fast as she is. The economic realities that have ruined the Bartlett farm have also caused Mr. Weller, the owner of the 650-acre farm on the other side of the Hamilton's house, to sell to Mr. Happney, a millionaire with Rockefeller connections who needs a tax loss. His millions transform the place into a picture from Vermont life. The barn is painted and expanded, and a ring and paddock are put in to accommodate the prize-winning Morgan horse that belongs to the Happney's beautiful society daughter, Sarah. Unfortunately, Sarah has failed some courses at Miss Porter's School for Girls, so she has to go to summer school. Mr. Weller and Mr. Wolfson, now the foreman and hired man on the farm, have told the Happneys that Peggy rides beautifully. So the Happneys condescend to visit the Hamiltons, and they ask Peggy to exercise the horse during the week, so Sarah can win ribbons on it during the weekends. When Peggy's family comes to watch her try out the horse, she gets a glimpse of class relations that she's never seen before. We all went, including Mr. Zander, who was unnaturally quiet. When we got to the Hathneys, Mr. Weller pointed to the arena behind the barn, grinning in a way that puzzled me until I saw Mr. Wolfson finish saddling the horse and lead her to the ring where Sarah waited. "Thank you, Wolfson," she said, giving him a lovely smile. "Now, Peggy, before you mount, make her stretch like this." So the ride goes fine, but Peggy is very puzzled because Sarah seems to be the kind of girl that she is supposed to be, and yet her family is obviously unhappy. So she talks to Mr. Zander as she walks him to his MG. "Okay," I said, "tell me what's up." He wiped a piece of lint off his mirror. "About the horse? She's great, lucky you." "Don't bullshit me. Everybody's upset, including you." "Perceptive Peggy," he said. "It's not the horse directly. It's the money? The manners? Ah, so you noticed. How dumb do you think I am?" "Thank you, Wolfson. Jesus H. Christ." He shook his head, half smiling. "Then perhaps you also noticed that to your new neighbors, Weller, the Wolfsons, the Bartletts, you, your parents, me, we're all part of the huge class that waits on them. The lesser gentry, the tenants, the local farmers, the servants, the walk-on parts in Jane Austen." For a second I got sidetracked because I hadn't thought of Jane Austen that way. He was looking at me very hard. "See why we're not happy?" "Sure. By writing Dolly, I become the same sort of servant as Mr. Wolfson and Mr. Weller, right?" "You got it." "Well, don't worry," I said, shrugging. "The Hathneys are richer than we are, but we're still gentry, and I'm being brought up to be a lady. So there's no danger that anybody who matters will confuse me with Mr. Weller or Mr. Wolfson or..." "Good Lord, Peggy." "Well," I said, "you talk about class and inequality all the time. How can you do that and expect me not to notice what's right in front of me?" Ironically, exercising the horse leads to a situation in which androgynous Peggy feels she belongs. Sarah's championships have all been at the junior level, but now she's 18. And adult riders outclass her at the National Morgan Horse Show. She thus loses interest so abruptly that her father sells the horse at the show, and the whole family goes back to the city. Thus, on Monday morning, when Peggy comes down to exercise the Morgan, she finds Mr. Weller and Mr. Wolfson looking at a poor, starved mare that's just been bought from an auction by a character called Joe the Frenchman. They ask her to ride the horse because she rides English, and their regular guy only rides Western. When she gets on, she proves that the mare has been beautifully trained. "Sweet Jesus," says Joe, "I can sell her as a lady's mount." It's the beginning of a partnership. Instead of riding for the rich, Peggy rides a series of horses for Joe, who is, not to put too fine a point on it, a horse trader. Of course, the partnership encounters difficulties. Peggy's family finds out what she's been doing, and technically out of concern for her safety, they forbid her to work with Joe anymore. But the partnership is threatened more seriously the next summer when the great man inherits what Peggy calls real money, which changes the nature of the place because he builds not only a barn, but a tennis court. The tennis court became a reality while the barn retained what the great man called its platonic form. The reason, I gradually realized, was that Herb and Don, those are her sister's husbands, needed more incentive to spend weekends in Vermont than cutting brush and weeding vegetables. Nor were they alone. As Don put it, the whole summer crowd's looking for a place to play, and if we had a court, we'd provide a focus for those people. The focus began before the court was even built. One tanned, athletic young man after another dropped by to look at our site. And the next Saturday, an older tanned athletic man with Networks Unlimited on his truck came into the kitchen with plans and estimates and left 2 hours later with a check. After Herb and Don took off for a celebratory beer, I spotted the great man whacking a croquet ball moodily around the lawn and went out to join him. Is it really gonna happen? Looks like it. I took courage from the ambivalence in his face. But here? On a farm? He sighed. Peggy, sometimes you have to let the younger generation lead the way. It's going to be their world, after all. What about the people in the younger generation who like Vermont the way it is? He raised his eyebrows. You don't want a court? Last I heard, your tennis had gotten so good you could have been on the JV team if we hadn't spent summers here. Well, yeah, but liking tennis is different from building a court of your own. You think so, do you? I felt treacherous waters lap around my ankles. Well, but you do like the snappy little car and the piano and the barn when we built it. Oh, the barn is real Vermont. Horse, tractor, lumber, workbench, tools. As for the others, you can play with those by yourself without looking nouveau riche. I tried to smile as the treacherous waters reached my neck. Well, nouveau riche is better than no riche at all. He laughed, and I was saved. The tennis court comes between Peggy and her horse trading friends. Most tragically, it comes between her and one of the riders for Joe the Frenchman, Jake Amadon, an 18-year-old guy who looks like Shane and has the same sort of cool and can keep his seat on anything with 4 legs and a tail. He and Peggy meet when she's riding by and the young horse he's on bucks, rears, and carries on while he sits on top, unfazed, and tips his 10-gallon hat to her. At Mr. Wolfson's request, Peggy walks her horse around the ring in front of the young horse, and gradually it quiets down. As Peggy is nearly wordless with admiration, Jake cautiously makes a friendly overture. After he'd got through the gate, he turned around. Look how quiet this house is when there's nobody on him. It's a crying shame. Supposing I was to ask Joe for a week with him, and we tag along with you so we can see how a good horse acts. No go, said Mr. Wolfson quickly. Peggy's folks don't want her dealing with Joe. Afraid she'll get hurt. And you gotta hand it to 'em. They found her a horse in a million. He patted Red, looking up at me so kindly I felt bad all over again. Say, he said, I see you've got some excavating going on up at your place. Are they building you a riding ring? Don't I wish, I said. It's a tennis court. Jeez, Jake turned and stared at me. Listen, I said, let me ask my parents if you can take a young horse out with Red and me. If they say yes, I'll tell Mr. Wolfson. He can tell you, okay? No call to make trouble, he said, pleasantly enough, but in a flat voice nobody could mistake. Joe's in a hurry for this guy anyway, and he led his horse into the barn. In the next story, Jake and Peggy fashion a sort of working arrangement by riding together. The mothers on both sides are very worried. Mr. Zander is jealous. But all this adult concern is wasted. What Peggy learns from Jake is that he's unreachable because she's part of the very world she deplores, and the class whose narrow vision she's well aware of. I was like them, she says, no matter how much I wanted to be just me. And there we will leave Peggy, caught between two worlds, one of which she loves but which is no longer sustainable, and one into which she's being slowly and relentlessly pushed, not just by her family, but by a whole set of sociological changes that affect both her and Vermont. Whether that's a sad story or not, I leave to you to decide. But whatever you decide, don't worry about Peggy. She sees clearly, she feels deeply, and she simply cannot tell the truth without embellishing it. She's clearly going to be a professional liar. She'll be fine.
So the cards on your chairs and the paper are to write questions, because we'll have to have you do that rather than stand, because as Laura said, she is in fact profoundly hearing impaired. So take a few minutes. If you have questions, write them down. We'll collect them, and then we'll have a conversation.
I will read them all, folks.
Yes.
I knew I was supposed to do this while she was talking. So I hope you can read me.
I know you were just in England visiting your sisters. What is their reaction to Lyra from Vermont? Well, the oldest sister, who told me she would give it bad reviews, does not know it is in print. Her children, I didn't tell her, no. Her children have all read it and love it. And my other sister, the one who gave me the typewriter, thus starting my career, said, well, it was a different point of view on our family from hers, but she liked it anyway. So, as I say, everybody has families. Right? How much did I rewrite? the first story after my sister's criticism. Almost not at all. All right, the stuff I did was not because of her criticism. I got Odysseus in there. She says she's a terrible liar like Stalin, and he says, no, no, no. Stalin has just died. She said, no, no. She's a liar like Odysseus. They started, and that allowed me to attach her lying to literature and literary career. That was the missing link. And I lightened it up just a little bit. There was no point in making her an unhappy kid because she wasn't so. Are your books on CDs? I'm afraid they're not. No, none of them. I'm not famous enough.
You should be.
Well, thank you. I wish they were. Yeah, I don't think there's any way around that. To hire somebody to read. You said don't worry about Peggy, but her clear sight scares me. Will she find a reward in her adult life for her sacrifices? What sacrifices? She hasn't sacrificed anything yet.
2 horses!
No, she'll be fine. She'll be fine. She'll turn into a novelist. Maybe she'll be famous. Maybe her books will come out on CDs. There's a lot that Peggy can do. Anybody else? Okay, then. Thank you. Thank you for coming. This is a great spot.
Thank you.